The bread was almost gone. On the wooden table lay a loaf so dark it was nearly black, its crust cracked like dry soil. A woman cut it carefully with a small iron knife, pressing down slowly so the blade would not crush the soft center. The smell was sour rye flour mixed with ground peas and whatever grain the family had managed to save from the last harvest. 3 children watched the knife. No one spoke. Outside, frost clung to the bare fields. The soil had already been turned for spring, but the ground offered nothing yet. The next harvest remained months away. Inside the cottage, every crumb mattered. Historians who study rural Europe before industrialization agree on one uncomfortable truth. For millions of ordinary farming families between the 16th and 18th centuries, hunger was not an occasional disaster. It was the background condition of everyday life. What pressed quietly into moments like this was something most rural families already understood too well. In the 17th century, the vast majority of Europeans lived in villages scattered across fields, forests, and river valleys. Cities existed: Paris, London, Vienna, but they held only a small fraction of the population. Between 70 and 90% of people lived from the soil. Their survival depended not on markets or wages, but on what the earth yielded each year. Across much of rural France, the German states, northern Italy, and England, agricultural life followed patterns that had changed little for centuries. Fields stretched outward from the village in long, narrow strips, divided among families under the open field system. Each household cultivated scattered pieces of land rather than a single enclosed farm. The arrangement forced cooperation, but it also meant vulnerability. A poor harvest affected everyone at once. Above the villagers stood a rigid social hierarchy. Land belonged largely to nobles, monasteries, or wealthy landlords. Peasant families worked the soil but rarely owned it outright. They owed rents in grain, labor services during planting and harvest, and taxes demanded by both local lords and distant kings. The church collected its own share as well, the tithe, typically a tenth of what the land produced. Weather governed everything. A wet spring drowned seeds before they could sprout. A dry summer hardened the soil until the plow blade scraped uselessly across the surface. An early frost could erase an entire season of labor in a single night. Europe's climate during this period fell within what historians call the Little Ice Age, a long stretch of colder, unstable weather between the 14th and 19th centuries. Shorter growing seasons and sudden storms increased the risk of crop failure. Within the system lived an ordinary rural household: a man, a woman, several children, perhaps an aging parent. Their cottage stood at the edge of a village road packed with mud and animal dung. Their land consisted of several narrow strips in communal fields: rye, barley, perhaps oats, along with a small garden behind the house. Their survival depended on one thing, something that could quietly disappear long before the next harvest arrived. Morning arrived long before the sun cleared the horizon. Inside the cottage, the air felt damp and cold against the skin. 5 people had slept in the same room. Their breath hung faintly in the darkness, a pale fog that faded and returned with each exhale. The straw mattress beneath them rustled as someone shifted dried stalks pressed inside a coarse linen sack, flattened by months of use and carrying the dusty smell of old grain. The fire had died sometime in the night. Only gray ash remained in the hearth, cool to the touch. Without the fire, the room held the chill of the early hour. In winter months, surviving accounts from rural households indicate that the temperature inside such cottages could fall close to the freezing point before dawn. The man woke first. His joints stiffened when he stood. The packed earth floor felt cold under bare feet. He crossed the room and stirred the ashes with a small iron poker, searching for any remaining heat. Occasionally, a buried ember survived, glowing faintly like a dull red eye. This morning there was nothing. He stepped outside. The door creaked as it opened, and the smell of damp soil rushed in. A faint gray light stretched across the fields. Frost clung to the edges of cabbage leaves in the small garden behind the house, and the wooden bucket near the well held a thin skin of ice. Somewhere in the distance, a rooster called sharp, uneven, echoing across the quiet village. Morning tasks began immediately. He relieved himself behind a low fence near the edge of the yard, steam rising briefly in the cold air. Hygiene followed simple routines shaped by necessity rather than comfort. Water drawn from the well stung the hands with its coldness. He splashed a little across his face, rubbed sleep from his eyes, and wiped his hands on a strip of rough cloth tied to his belt. Inside the cottage, the woman had risen as well. She moved quietly so the younger children could sleep a few minutes longer. The room smelled faintly of smoke, damp wool, and the sour tang of fermented grain. She cut the bread. The loaf resisted the knife at first, its crust tough and uneven. This was not wheat bread. Wheat rarely appeared on a peasant table except during rare, prosperous years. The bread came from rye flour mixed with whatever the household possessed: ground peas, crushed oats, sometimes even powdered acorns during the leanest seasons. The slice tasted heavy and slightly bitter. Each person received a piece small enough to finish in a few bites. They chewed slowly. Dry crumbs clung to the tongue, and the bread left a dense weight in the stomach that felt like food even when it provided little nourishment. Light slowly strengthened outside the small window opening. The color of that light mattered. Some shades of morning light made the day feel uncertain before any work had even begun. Thick gray clouds carried the smell of rain and the risk of lost work. The man studied the sky while he finished the last crumbs of bread, measuring the day ahead. In this world, the morning always began with calculation: how long the food would last. By mid-morning, the man stood in the open field behind a wooden plow. The soil felt heavy beneath his boots. A thin layer of frost had softened under the rising sun, turning the surface into a sticky mixture of mud and broken roots. He leaned forward and pushed the plow blade deeper into the earth while the ox strained against its leather harness. The animal's breath came out in warm bursts that smelled faintly of grass and manure. The plow itself was simple, a wooden frame reinforced with a narrow iron tip. It did not slice cleanly through the soil the way modern steel plows would centuries later. Instead, it scratched and lifted the earth in rough lines, turning just enough dirt to bury seed. Each pass demanded strength. The man gripped the wooden handles with both hands. Splinters pressed into his palms. When the blade struck a buried stone, the entire tool jerked violently backward, sending a shock through his arms and shoulders. He adjusted his stance, forced the plow forward again, and followed the slow movement of the ox across the strip of land. The sound of the field surrounded him. Crows called from the trees along the boundary hedge. The leather harness creaked with every step of the animal. Iron scraped stone whenever the plow blade struck hidden rocks beneath the surface. Wind carried the smell of damp soil and crushed weeds. This single strip of land belonged to his household, but dozens of similar strips stretched across the communal field. Other villagers worked nearby. A woman bent over a hoe further down the row, breaking clumps of soil into smaller pieces. Two boys carried baskets of manure from a cart, spreading it across the ground with wooden forks. No one spoke much. The rhythm of the work absorbed attention. The plowing continued hour after hour. Sweat soaked through the man's rough linen shirt even in the cool air of early spring. His back tightened from the constant pressure of leaning forward. Historians who study skeletal remains from rural populations often note the physical markers of this labor: compressed vertebrae, worn knee joints, and shoulders reshaped by years of repetitive strain. Around midday, the work paused briefly. He sat on a low stone at the edge of the field. The ox lowered its head and tore mouthfuls of grass from the ditch beside the road. From a cloth bundle tied at his waist, the man removed the day's meal: another piece of dark bread and a small onion. He bit into the onion first. The sharp taste burned his tongue and watered his eyes. The bread followed dense, dry, filling enough to dull the edge of hunger. Water from a wooden flask washed the food down with a faint, earthy taste from the well. The break lasted perhaps 15 minutes. The remaining ground waited in long, unbroken lines across the field. And every furrow mattered because the success of the coming harvest depended on the work done today. The greatest threat to this household did not arrive suddenly. The final weeks before the new crop had a name, people spoke quietly in many villages. Most peasant families measured the year not by seasons, but by the distance between harvests. Grain gathered in late summer had to last until the following harvest nearly 12 months later. Historians call the final weeks before the new crop the hungry gap. By spring, the wooden bins that had once held sacks of rye or barley often stood nearly empty. During these months, bread changed. Families stretched flour by grinding dried peas, beans, or chestnuts into powder and mixing them into the dough. In poorer regions, surviving accounts describe bread made partly from grass seeds or tree bark ground into meal. The taste turned bitter and sour. The texture grew coarse enough to scratch the mouth. Hunger did not always mean immediate starvation. More often, it meant a slow weakening of the body. Children felt it first. Their ribs became visible beneath the skin. Their stomachs swelled from diets poor in protein. Historians studying parish burial records from 17th century France and England note that child mortality often spiked during late winter and early spring, precisely when household food stores ran lowest. Illness followed close behind hunger. A fever in this household had few effective treatments. Village healers used remedies drawn from long observation: willow bark for pain, garlic for infection, honey applied to wounds. But diseases such as dysentery, typhus, or smallpox spread quickly through communities that lived in close quarters. In 1694, northern France suffered one of the worst famine years of the century. Continuous rain ruined the harvest. Contemporary records from the region of Normandy describe villagers digging through frozen fields for leftover grain heads missed during harvest. Parish priests wrote of families boiling grass and nettles to survive. Historians estimate that more than 1 million people across France died during the famine of 1693 to 1694. Economic pressure tightened the trap. Even when harvests failed, rents still had to be paid. A peasant household owed grain or coin to the landlord who owned the land. They owed taxes to the crown. They owed a tithe to the church. When crops fell short, families sold tools, animals, or clothing to cover these obligations. The loss of an ox could destroy a household's future. Without the animal, plowing became nearly impossible. Grief also lived close at hand. Many families buried children before those children reached adulthood. Parish registers across early modern Europe show the same repeated pattern. Small graves dug behind village churches year after year. Parents who worked the fields by day sometimes returned in the evening to sit beside freshly turned soil where a child had been buried that morning. This world required endurance, not for a single crisis, but for the constant possibility that the next winter might be the one that finished them. The light faded slowly across the fields. Work did not end suddenly. The man guided the ox through one last furrow, then lifted the plow blade from the soil and wiped the mud from its iron tip with a handful of grass. The animal's sides moved heavily with each breath, its hide warm and damp beneath the fading warmth of the day. The walk back to the village felt quieter than the morning. Smoke drifted from cottage chimneys and carried the smell of burning wood and peat across the road. Chickens scratched in the dust between houses. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked once and then settled again. Inside the cottage, the fire burned low but steady. The woman had coaxed it back to life with dry twigs and pieces of split wood. Orange light flickered across the walls, revealing the rough texture of the timber beams and the packed earth floor worn smooth by years of footsteps. The room smelled of smoke, boiled grain, and damp wool drying near the hearth. The evening meal waited in a small iron pot. Barley porridge thickened slowly as it cooled, its surface forming a thin skin. The taste carried a faint sweetness from the grain and a smoky note from the fire beneath the pot. Sometimes a small piece of cabbage or a scrap of salted pork found its way into the mixture, but most evenings the meal remained simple. Each person ate from a wooden bowl. The spoon scraped softly against the sides as the children finished their portions. Warm food settled heavily in the stomach, bringing a brief sense of comfort after the day's labor. For a short time, the room held something close to peace. The fire crackled. The children spoke quietly to one another. The man repaired a broken leather strap from the ox harness, pulling a bone needle through thick hide while the woman spun coarse wool into thread using a small wooden spindle. Prayer followed before sleep. Most rural households ended the day this way. The words came from memory short prayers learned in childhood, spoken beside the fire with heads bowed. Religion shaped not only belief, but rhythm. Morning, evening, planting, harvest, birth, burial. Darkness deepened beyond the door. Inside the cottage, the fire burned down until only glowing embers remained. One by one, the family lay down on the straw mattress again. The air cooled quickly as the heat faded. Some worries only seemed to surface once the house had gone quiet. Illness often worsened after sunset. A child's cough sounded louder in the dark. A fever rose when there were no remedies left to try. Many deaths recorded in parish registers occurred in the early hours before dawn, when families waited beside the bed and listened to breathing grow slower. Outside, the village fell silent. The only sound left was the quiet shifting of straw as tired bodies settled into sleep, and the long wait for morning began again. Survival in this world required far more than endurance. It required knowledge accumulated slowly across generations, tested through failure, remembered because forgetting could mean hunger. Some of that knowledge determined whether food remained by the time the fields fell silent. Rural households relied heavily on drying and salting. Cabbages became sauerkraut through fermentation in wooden barrels, a method that preserved nutrients through winter and produced a sharp, sour smell that filled the cellar when the lid was opened. Meat from the autumn slaughter of a pig was rubbed heavily with salt and hung from rafters where smoke from the hearth drifted upward, drying the flesh and preventing rot. Grain storage demanded equal care. Peasant families protected their harvest in wooden bins, raised slightly off the ground to prevent dampness and rodents. The grain had to remain dry, and households inspected the stores regularly for signs of mold or insects. A spoiled grain supply could destroy the food security of an entire year. Agricultural practice also showed quiet ingenuity. The open field system often followed a rotation of crops that modern historians recognize as an early form of soil management. A common pattern divided land into three sections, one planted with winter grain such as rye or wheat, another with spring crops like barley or oats, and a third left fallow to recover nutrients. This three-field rotation increased productivity compared with older two-field systems and allowed communities to maintain soil fertility across generations. Village life also relied on mutual aid. When harvest approached, families did not work entirely alone. Surviving village records from England and parts of Germany describe neighbors gathering to bring in crops together during critical weeks when rain or frost threatened the fields. A sick farmer's family might receive help from others who cut and bundled the grain so it would not spoil. These arrangements were rarely formal contracts. They operated through reputation, obligation, and the understanding that any household could face misfortune next year. Knowledge of plants formed another quiet system of survival. Village healers and experienced women collected herbs from hedgerows and forest edges. Yarrow helped stop bleeding. Comfrey roots were applied to bruises and broken bones. Chamomile tea eased stomach pain. These remedies emerged from observation rather than written science, but many proved effective enough that versions of them remain in use today. These practices did not remove the threat of hunger, but they extended the narrow margin between survival and starvation, a margin built from skill, cooperation, and memory. One detail often surprises modern readers of peasant household accounts. The loaves described in those records often contained more than grain alone. Surviving records from parts of rural Germany and France describe loaves mixed with ground peas, beans, or chestnuts during ordinary years, not only during famine. Bakers and households stretched expensive grain flour with other plant materials to make supplies last longer. The result tasted heavier and sometimes slightly bitter, but it provided calories that pure rye or wheat alone could not supply. This meant the daily bread that sustained rural families often looked and tasted very different from what the word bread suggests today. Another fact appears repeatedly in parish records across early modern Europe. Most peasant families lived permanently close to the edge of hunger even in years without famine. Economic historians studying farm accounts from 17th century England estimate that a typical small household produced only a modest surplus above its annual food needs. A single bad harvest caused by rain, frost, or plant disease could erase that margin entirely. The security people associate with farming rarely existed for those who worked the land. A third reality sits quietly inside the bones of the dead. Archaeologists who examine skeletons from rural cemeteries frequently find lines in children's teeth known as enamel hypoplasia. These faint grooves form when a child's body temporarily stops growing due to severe stress, often caused by malnutrition or disease. The marks remain for life. Those teeth carry physical evidence of hunger experienced decades earlier. Another historical detail reveals how carefully food had to be guarded. In many rural communities, laws punished grain theft harshly. Court records from 17th century England and the Low Countries document cases where individuals caught stealing small amounts of wheat or barley faced whipping, imprisonment, or public humiliation in the village stocks. Authorities treated grain theft seriously because even minor losses threatened the fragile balance of a household's food supply. The law recognized what everyone already knew. Grain meant survival. And one final fact lingers in written accounts from the period. Some families deliberately delayed grinding their grain into flour until the last possible moment. Whole grain stored in bins resisted spoilage longer than flour. Milling it too early risked losing precious food to mold or insects before it could be eaten. This meant that the decision to grind grain, the simple act of turning kernels into bread, carried the quiet weight of strategy, calculation, and fear. Every loaf represented a choice about the future. The distance between that world and the present rests on fragile foundations. Much of that distance depends on systems most people rarely stop to consider. Grain travels across oceans. Harvest failures in one region can be replaced by shipments from another. Supermarket shelves refill overnight. The constant background calculation that shaped peasant life, whether the food will last until the next harvest, has largely disappeared from daily thought. But for the rural families who lived between the 16th and 18th centuries, that calculation never left them. They worked fields in every season, not because they sought prosperity, but because survival demanded it. They studied the sky, guarded their grain stores, shared labor with neighbors, and stretched every loaf of bread as far as it could go. Within those narrow margins, they still raised children, cared for the sick, told stories beside the fire, and buried their dead with the same grief any family knows. Their lives were not simple. They were disciplined acts of endurance. A question remains. If a single year of harvest failure could threaten an entire village with hunger, what does that reveal about how thin the line between stability and crisis has always been in human history?